Furtado de Mendoza is an important authority of the modiste for the legitimacy of modi reum in Aristotelian philosophy, which was highly debated during the second scholasticism in the first half of the 7th century, not least against the Cartesian background. But what is Furtado's own position within this tradition? In how far does he move beyond Suarez and the medieval mainly Scottish doctrine? This will be shown with the help of the relevant questions in the physics and metaphysics. I will not speak about the incarnation here, it's too long. To overlap between Aristotelian substance accident ontology and the res modus paradigm in the reading of Suarez, who follows medieval Scotism and Durandus as Porziano, marks a serious intervention into the peripatetic theory of being. Accepting the modus means to assume a positive entity which affects the reality res absoluta, then it is increasingly considered to be indeterminate as such. So a determination is given to a res, which is primarily outside of the essence of the res, but cannot exist separated from res even by divine omnipotence. In contrast to the concept of substance with change in absolute or relative accidents, which is thoroughly determined by its essential form, much more elaborated tools for description are developed by going back on medieval discussions. Parallel to this distinctio modalis, this also allows an ontological interpretation of predication concerning formal determinations such as causality, unification, location, and temporality, or certain points in space and time, etc., and above all of processes in their particular stages. However, such determination or entities cannot just be assumed as real identical with the corresponding res as such. On the other hand, they do not really fit into the relatively rough scheme of standard Aristotelian ontology, since the distinctio modalis between entity and modus is minor than a real distinction, but greater than a distinctio rationis. In the Jesuit order, the existence and legitimacy of such modi is debated as well. Following Duns Scotus, who had already used the formal distinction as an argument against Aegidius Romanus, Franciscus de Marunis extensively developed the doctrine of the modus internus. Hence, its formalistic solution was also preferred by Scotists within the Society of Jesus. Such determinations neither suggest a merely rational distinction, ratione ratiocinata, nor a real distinction from the object. Rather, they are different formalitates, equivalents of notions, conceptibilitates, which are objectively ex natura rei given and detected within the object. Above all, Wattings, Smilecki, and Morisanus and the Contemplicenses are called to be formalists among the Jesuits, who deal with modi in such a formalistic way. It is already for economic reason that some nominalists, as the followers of Benet Pereira, combat such an increase of entities and try to explain the ontological status of modi in a logical or semantic way as mere connotations or extrinsic denominations. What is Hurtado de Mendoza's position here? First, the determination of modus. As Sven Knebel has shown in his 20 different meanings of modus essendi, modus is a very rather vaguely determined term from a semantic point of view, which still applies to its specific usage in res modus ontology. Suarez will define it relatively vague as something positive which affects an entity out of its own by giving something to this entity which is outside its own entire individually existing essence. A According to the wording, however, this does also apply to real accidents or extrinsic denominations, and it does not define modus in the proper sense of the word. Hurtado also remains relatively vague in his determination of modus, which will lead to further discussions afterwards. He opens the section 5 of the second disputation of his metaphysics with a clear statement: duo genera entium reperio, on the one hand ens entitas res, and on the other hand modus or entitas modalis. The criterion which guides Hurtado's discussion from the very beginning is separability. If an entity can exist separately from further determinations through divine omnipotence, then it is res, if not, it is modus. For Hurtado, the distinction between both is a real distinction in the sense of a distinctio realis modalis. This shows that he exclusively deals with the external modus, not the internal. With a typically Jesuit indifference concerning further determinations, the res itself is seen as something which is simply necessary in order to overcome this indifference. From the very beginning, the logical and theological important unio, the unification of matter and form, or of body and soul, which can be separated, can exist separated, serves as Hurtado's classic example for a modus. Nevertheless, a modus is not efficient cause here, since then it would be able to exist without producing the effect. Rather, two real states of affairs have to be distinguished within the modus. On the one hand, the determination of the res, and on the other hand, the dependency on a material or and efficient cause. Only the first determination is essential for the modus. However, the modus, regarded as ut quod, is not efficient principle, but produced itself by a material or efficient cause. In the revised edition of 1624, Hurtado adds 4 paragraphs for examination of his opponents. Here, who diverge from the Sententia Communis and rejects the common notion of modus, since its essence would consist in not producing any effect. However, the acts of living, which the opponents regard as modi, produce effects, whereas Hurtado justifies the ineffectiveness of the modus by arguing that the efficient principle is basically indifferent regarding different individual effects, which is explicitly excluded for the modus by definition. These opponents do not come up with any justification. Nevertheless, Hurtado modifies his thesis of basically ineffectiveness of the modus insofar as the modus is able to produce a species impressa and therefore to be perceived. Now, he only claims probability but not evidence for total ineffectiveness. Apparently, the theological applications in the treatise of the Incarnation were decisive for this change of his theory. He wants to assume 2 formal effects in the modus now. First, the elimination of the indifference of the res, and second, the determination of one res to another. The modus is not indifferent regarding these effects. Nevertheless, it is indifferent regarding further effects. For instance, that the unification of body and soul is produced here and there. It means that it can assume different locations in space. Hence, it does not contradict the definition of modus to behave indifferently with regard to further effects in the sense of causalitas activa. However, Hurtado still clearly keeps his criterion of inseparability as a posteriori determination of the modus here. This criterion alone but is insufficient, as the following discussion among Arriaga, Oviedo and Bartolomeo Mastri shows. Arriaga still keeps the posteriori criterion of separability, but considers Hurtado a priori definition as actualis determinatio rei indifferentis to be insufficient. since it appears as too restrictive and contains a relation. However, if the relation is considered to be self-referential, the definition would be modus est qui est actualis determinatio ad se ipsum. In the case, however, it does not explain anything and moreover contradicts the rules of logic, because the following expression would emerge: modus est qui reddit subjectum actuali der habens modum. Which apparently is a circular definition, since modus is not no self-referential term. Therefore, Arriaga replaces Hurtado's determinatio through the neat generic concept informatio and introduces the definition modus est actualis informatio subjectum. This definition only reveals its proper sharpness if one examines Arriaga's theory of the information of the subject more closely. What still appears as a helomorphistic doctrine of from the outside has become the constitution of a totality from primarily individual internal parts through a modal unio. The subjectum informationis is defined as something which is incomplete in itself, and it's only completed through the unification with something else, illud quod in se incompletum est, et unitur alteri a quo perficitur. Basically, this is applicable to the res absoluta, which is only completed through modi. However, this is precisely what Arriaga does no longer explain with an actuation of matter, but being a subject is only a natural being, earlier a being which is unified with another being. And only this way is thoroughly determined. In contrast to a mere informatio aptitudinalis, of absolute substantial or accidental form regarded as res, the modus is actual information. Francisco de Oviedo extensively deals with Arriaga's definition and principally follows Hurtado while trying to refute Arriaga's objections. In doing so, however, he understands informare as determinare again. He does not assume the informatio aptitudinalis or actualis as fundamental distinction between res and modus, since in principle one res cannot determine the other through itself, because following Hurtado it is internally indifferent and in need of determination on its own. Mastri thinks that Hurtado's definition is insufficient, since it presupposes inseparability, but does not explain it, and since it is too wide, because, for instance, an actus vitalis would be a modus then, which, however, Hurtado denies as well. However, Arriaga's definition is even worse than all others for Mastri, since definiens and definiendum are inconvertible here. Also, all information of a subject is a modus. Not every modus is information of a subject if it is regarded as the unification of a form with the subject. This is only true in case of unio, but not for motion and location in space, which are, however, no modi for Arriaga, and actio and passio, etc. Suarez' definition for Mastri appears the most acceptable. Which modi has been to be assumed? Contrary to the modiste, who assume an abundance of extrinsic modi, unio, actio, passio, figura, situs, extensio, duratio, habitus, vitalitas, subsistentia, etc., Hurtado is very restrictive in his examination of possible candidates for modi, comparable to Arriaga afterwards. In principle, he only allows three real modi: ubication, unification, and causality, but not duration, vitalitas, supernaturalitas, subsistence, and actus vitalis. Ubication is the determination of a movable res at a certain location, whereas the mobile is indifferent at first. Therefore, a location in space is necessary in order to determine the distance to other objects as well. In 1624, Hurtado extends this discussion with an extensive refutation of the thesis that the location in space is a res absoluta, as it was later assumed by Arriaga. In this opinion, that the ubication is a res absoluta, in this opinion, in space, the location in space can be understood in two ways. First, an absolute res ubi freely moves around in space and must be determined at certain location. This is evidently wrong. Second, the ubi as such is determined at a certain location from which it cannot be separated even by divine omnipotence, but at least through divine omnipotence it could be one time at x, as well at x way, at Peter and at Paul. Hence it is not determined in a priori way to which particular location the ubi refers. However, an union between ubi and the object located in space is then needed, which would be determined in a way so that no other unifications are necessary and an infinitive regress is explicitly excluded. This is Arriaga's argument as well. Hurtado only finds additional difficulties here, since then, first of all, the unio had to take over the proper function of the modus ubicatio, and moreover, the motion of location itself would have to produce this unio at a certain location. For Hurtado, the most important modus is unio, especially in case of matter and form, as he extensively shows in his physical disputations, we will hear about. Unio is the unification of two res which are indifferent concerning this unification and could at least through divine omnipotence exist separately. Therefore, they still have to determine for their unification, especially matter and the particular form or body and individual soul. And the unification always applies to two things in order to resolve their indifference. This presupposes their determination by unio. However, if matter, form, and unio are given, then the actual unification cannot be hindered even by divine omnipotence, since the unification is a formal effect of the unio willed by God. The modus exactly contains the formal content of determination which is given to the res. A real existing modus does not do so, does not do so is for Hurtado is impossible. Therefore, a real unio is of this matter A and as a form B is no longer indifferent on its own, and moreover does not need further unio in order to be determined for this union. Rather, the modus is the last determination of the determined object. From the point of realistic semantic, only it makes possible to name the res according to its determination. Furthermore, the latter is not formally dependent on the will of God, who, for instance, wants that the matter A and the form B, A and the form B are unified. Contrary to the nominalists, God precisely wants that a determined unio created by him achieves its unique formal effect. Hurtado defends the unio modus distinction realiter modaliter against Cajetan's Thomist view, which also is proposed by Gregory of Valencia and the nominalists, that the unification merely is a form unified with matter. However, the being of the form in matter is real distinct from pure form being, and therefore a new modus which is not given with form being as such. Meanwhile, the Scotus distinctio actualis formalis is actually identical with the distinctio realis modalis for Hurtado. Nevertheless, the modus is in no way an entity which could exist on its own, or could be conserved without the two unified entities. Therefore, no further unio for the unification is needed, as a frequent objection from Thomist and Scotus suggests. In 1624, Hurtado adds a long subsectio concerning the theologically justified debate with the connotatores who deny a distinction ex natura rei between the unio and the unified parts, and only wants to see the connotation on the side of the matter or the form, which cannot be hindered through divine omnipotence in case of the closest coexistence. But even if all requirements are given, God could prevent the modus of the unio for this opinion. For Hurtado, this is absurd. Since God cannot want that all disposition of unification are given, whereas the latter does not happen, because then the correspondence between denomination and signified res in so all realistic semantic would be abrogated. Moreover, the unio is not identical with the production of form, but precisely means a specifically produced bond and the formal connection of two parts. It is also not only the causality of matter with regard to the form and used from it, which would already be impossible, for instance, in case of the unification between body and soul. So Hurtado, together with Suarez and above all Vasquez, criticizes the sententia communis, which understand unio as unitio in a causal way from a linguistic point of view. Nevertheless, and this is again, as Hurtado's highly debated thesis in the following time, unio, which essentially consists in two subuniones, is needed for the unification of matter and form, informatio and materializatio. Quite similar to Arriaga, Hurtado regards matter and form as entities existing for themselves and not as potentiality and actuality as in the Thomism. However, two entities existing on their own, respectively, need the corresponding modi of unio for themselves. Concerning form, unio is informatio, and only the latter perfects the form for its unification with matter. Despite its transcendental tendency toward matter, form can exist without being unified with matter, as, for instance, the soul without a body. Hence, the modus informatio is needed for the formal communication of form to matter, for the constitution of the compositum, and for the ability of the form to become active in this unification. First of all, the autonomous form has to be determined through the informatio, which is the actual proprium exercitium formae. Concerning matter, materializatio, which is distinguished from the also mentioned causation of material forms, is a modus of unification which enables matter to receive a form. To put in a nutshell, the modus, so to speak, gives the hooks of both parts and staples them together in a formal way, or we can also say in a way of the chemical synthesis. So as both entities appears. So Hurtado clearly departs from Suarez and Vasquez, who regards form itself as perfection of matter in concordance with tradition, and hence determines the form as beer of the unio. It's only in the concept of the hypostatic union where it is a long debate in the 1624 and in the Tractatus de Incarnatione, where this model is not to apply for the divine word, which has no tendency to the humanitas. The causality of material and efficient cause is considered to be a modus, since it does not belong to the essence of a cause as res to cause something actual here and now. Hence, an own determination is necessary for it if the modus of causalitas. Duration is excluded for Hurtado, since it is not really distinct from existence. which in turn is only intellectually distinct from essence. However, if duration was real distinct, it would be a modus by necessity of determination of a created being at a certain point of time as ubication in case or location. Nevertheless, existence is not a modus according to Hurtado, even if was real distinct from the essence, since it is not the real determination of the essence for existing here and now, but appears to be indifferent concerning these facts. So Hurtado also denies the model interpretation of existence by Pereira and Fonseca. Similarly, virtuality, vitality, and supernaturality are not determinations of acts in the sense of a modus, since they do not immediately determine a particular act regarding a certain potency, but only mediated through an unio. Following Scottish tradition, acts are seen as entities possibly brought about by God, which are connected with a certain potency afterwards. Moreover, the principal definition of modus as determinatio naturae et aliud does not apply to subsistence, since the latter is not a complementum naturae to something else. Furthermore, the subsistence does not give the determination to the res, which is expressed by the modus itself, and it does not eliminate the indifference. For Hurtado, relation is also excluded from the candidates for modi, since it is not distinct from fundamentum and terminus, but only expresses an extrinsic denomination. What has been said about vitalitas also applies to the actus vitalis, for instance, perception or experience. It is not a modus because it does not determine a potency for perception as such of a determined object. Rather, an unio is needed through which the actus vitalis communicates its formal effects to potency. Not the actus vitalis itself, but the unio is here the formal determination of potency for its object here, and it cannot, for instance, determine potency for perception without determining it for perception of a certain object at the same time. Only perception and unio together appears as determination of potency for an object of perception. Hence, to be determined for an object means nothing else than to possess a representation of the object which is unified with potency. However, another unio is modus, which is not the act of perception itself, is necessary for them. Moreover, perception is not a modus because it produces the habitus, and therefore it would violate the ineffectiveness of the modus. This is also true if one assumes that the vital acts produce themselves. What we need a modi indeed, but following Hurtado, we need no more modi than three: unio, ubicatio, and causality. That suffices, and therefore Hurtado is not an excessive modist, as some modists apply him for his own theory. Thank you.